Hello and welcome back to part 4 of Capitalist Realism, the media, which is what the title of this course is and why you are all here. Welcome back, Professor Marchia. Thank you for spending your day with us, answering our questions about various topics in relation to this theory. So now we're going to get into the concept of media and how is media related to capitalist realism. So let's start by just saying, what does capitalist realism have to do with the media, in your opinion?
I mean, there's a lot of connections, right? I mean, the media sets the terms and conditions of what's discussed, right? So the media is sort of the way in which ideas are sent out into the world, right? Mass media does that, and of course, that institution has its own agenda, its own way of viewing things, etc. Right? And in addition to news media, right? I mean, culture often reflects what's happening politically, right? And so there's also many ways in which you know uh, it could be the topics explored in media, but also just the way in which media is consumed, the way it's viewed, the way it's produced, that are also tied into um, capitalism or capitalist realism.
Absolutely. And I think that the media is at the center of the reproduction of capitalist realism because obviously we're all in it. We're all in this water. We're all swimming. And we all know that, well, now that we've watched these videos and listened and read capitalist realism, we realize that we're all independently operating in reinforcing these capitalist realist ideas. And we do it at all kinds of social institutions, right? At home with the family, at school with the peers. But media is really a top-down model almost of culture production, right? And not so much with the internet. And we can talk more about how that complicates things. But traditional media, be it news media or entertainment media, it's sort of something that is produced and then disseminated. And then, so when we live in a capitalist realist framework, the media that is disseminated is going to sort of create water. It's going to create the water that we then swim in and live in, right? So it's producing and reproducing and reintroducing capitalist realism into the cultural landscape. And then when we talk about sort of this fourth dimensional internet media, we are also engaging in reproducing this capitalist realism online, and maybe not in certain ways. And so the media is very important, and the reason I wanted this theory to be used in understanding media and society is that this gives us a way to sort of envision who is sort of cataloging our reality, right? It's the media. Media is cataloging our reality. We watch the media, we reflect the media reflects us, and that's where we decide what things are, what is possible. I mean, the people that tell us what is and is not possible is usually CNN. They're like, blah, blah, blah person can never be elected president because they're too old. Like, who decided that? The media created its narrative, and then it told us what truth was. And the media often decides what's normative and what's real, right? So the realism of it is very pervasive in the media sphere. And the best way to describe the relationship of the media, capitalist realism, and mental health is this concept of hyperreality that Fisher writes about, but is attributed actually to this postmodernist theorist. Have you read Baudrillard? I don't even know how to say this French
Yeah,
philosopher's name. Can you teach me how to say
I say
Baudrillard?
it the same way. I don't even know if it's correct.
Okay, it's okay. Funny sidebar and story that might make this more interesting is that in my undergrad years, my very amazing undergraduate professor was really into postmodernism, and she tried to teach me this stuff that is in the 2 or 3 pages of Mark Fisher, but she tried to teach us the actual theories of Baudrillard, and I remember thinking, what? This doesn't make any sense. And then I read Mark Fisher much later in life, and I read these pages, and then I texted her saying, I finally understand. I get those really complex and wonderful ideas you were trying to present to me because, okay, this actually does make a lot of sense. This is a great way to think about reality now. So let's get into page 48 of this text and hyperreality. Do you want to speak about hyperreality first, or do you want me to read some passages?
Let's do the quote and then
Yeah. Okay. So this is a long one where maybe we'll like break it up. So much of Baudrillard. So again, this is a postmodern theorist and sociologist. And we'll talk about what is postmodernism at some point, but that's maybe not super relevant right this second. But we'll get to it. Much of Baudrillard's work was a commentary on this effect, the way in which the abolition of the symbolic led to not a direct encounter with the real, but to a kind of hemorrhaging of the real. For Baudrillard, phenomena such as the fly on the wall documentaries and political opinion polls, both of which claim to present reality in an unmediated way, would always pose an insoluble dilemma. Did the presence of the cameras affect the behaviors of those being filmed? Would the publication of poll results affect the future behaviors of voters? Such questions were undecidable, and therefore reality would always be elusive. At the very moment when it seemed that it was being grasped in the raw, reality transformed into what Baudrillard, in a much misunderstood neologism, called hyperreality. So let's break there for a second and get your thoughts, and then we'll continue with the hyperreality segment.
Yeah. So if you imagine, I mean, to maybe make this a little bit less abstract, the real would just be what's actually happening on the ground in a certain context, right? Just what are people thinking, what's going on, blah, blah, blah. When you have news media, right, they're supposedly just giving you the facts, here's what's going on, right? But what's going on can be very complicated, right? So they have to sort of select what they're going to present to you, what format they're going to present it in, right? And so, they select a certain few amount of issues, a certain way of talking about it, and present it back to people. But this creates a feedback, right? Because what are people, the news is talking about what people are talking about. What are people talking about? What the news is talking about, right? And this keeps going, right, to a certain point where they're just, kind of reflecting each other, but it's not really actually touching the real. It's not actually what's touching what's going on, right? People are at this point not talking about, or not always talking about what's happening with them. They're talking about what's happening on the news, and then the news is reflecting that back. And this creates, right, hyperreality, like kind of simulation, right? We're all kind of talking about these particular conversations, even though, reality is so much more vast than that. And we're talking about it in a particular way, even though there's so many ways we could approach these issues or problems.
Yeah, and he talks about how reality is increasingly elusive because we are losing a grasp on what reality is anymore, because reality is a set of different narratives from a wide variety of perspectives, right? I mean, there's no way to really pinpoint and be like, this is reality, but actually there is. We have empirical methods, and in sociology, we can think about reality as the collective experience that, you and I can agree is true, and we can agree as a social contract with others that is true, right? But instead of presenting collective consensus truth in its rawest format, media as it functions today creates narratives. And what happens when we create narratives is we start sort of slicing out realities, right? Instead of being like, okay, here's the consensus and these are the facts with the consensus. When we start telling stories, then we are providing a perspective, and that's what all news media that exists today is propaganda. And we're going to come to that in this course. We're going to have a whole segment on the propaganda model of understanding news media. But for the understanding of the realism of it, right? News media, the way it exists now, is a storyteller. And the story could be anything. It could be that, okay, some cops were kneeling at the protests, and that's what they will show on CNN. And then we see the other side of that story on Twitter, that later the same police officers who are engaging in trigger warning harmful behaviors towards certain protesters. That part of the story is not shown in the media, right? Then the narrative becomes about these like very well-meaning law enforcement officers, and that's the narrative they're presenting by just only giving half of the information. So at any point news media is giving information, it is also telling us what to think of that information. And so then we think about information in the way they're telling us to, and that determines how we present information ourselves to others, and then we reproduce this, and then that narrative, like you said, is reflected back to us by the media. And so in the process of creating narratives, media has sort of gotten rid of reality, thinking of reality sociologically as consensus truth. Empirical consensus truth is no longer what we are living in. We are living in this narrative version of consensus truth that is sort of passed back and forth between the audience and the media. And that's hyperreality, right? That's this reality that lies underneath an actual reality of objective consensus. And the way media operates today, I mean, maybe, I don't know. I don't know the history of media very well, in that I don't know if historically we had media that was more unbiased. And I don't know if it's possible for media to be unbiased because it's narrative. But today, especially, right? Today in 24-hour news cycle where everybody is constantly trying to produce news content, there is this constant need to tell stories about what's going on. And so once you tell stories about what's going on, you're no longer telling the facts, because stories are an interpretation of reality. They're not reality. And to me, that's hyperreality. Hyperreality is living in a like metaphorical narrative about the reality we're living in, and that narrative is created at the media level. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and to tie it back to the idea of what's normal and natural and the realism aspect of it, you know, media, oh wow, I lost my train of thought.
That happened to me before. Do you want to take a second, or do you want to try to come back to it?
We'll come back.
Yeah, I know. That's a thing with like recording. Speaking of hyperreality.
Oh, sorry, I remembered. So in terms of the bias, right? You said like, was media always as biased? And it's definitely so, right? There was always a bias, but there was maybe less illusions about whether or not bias existed, right? Today, media more and more thinks of itself as not biased, right? And presents itself, and at least in the story it tells itself, is that we're the ones giving the real facts. We're not doing the bias, and we're really checking up against all these biases and illusions we may have. But in doing that, they reproduce the fact that they are biased, right? The more and more they disavow the bias they have, right? The more and more they present as not having that, they deflect from the actual reality of it, right? And so the more and more they do that, the more and more they normalize just the facts of it, right? They're being realists. But it's again a thing where this realism is actually a particular frame or way of viewing things, right?
Yeah.
So it actually obscures the fact that there is a bias.
Yeah, and I think the political opinion polls is just a wonderful example, because you have like media figures determining who is, for example, most electable in US elections, right? And then they like do these polls, and then this poll says like 40% of Americans want X, and then people see that poll and they see, oh, I want to be like the majority. I want to be in the normative real space of this hyperreality. Like the average person, by virtue of being average, is probably more inclined to conform to societal standards than not. So when you see that the majority of people, according to this one poll, we don't know where the poll came from, we don't know the sampling strategy, it's one poll, right? We don't really understand the extent to which that sample speaks to the population, we don't know the methodologies that were used. Like, those are all questions that we need to consider before allowing news media to sort of like let this like cat out of the bag. But even just from like one poll, the day they released, like, okay, this one poll of like 500 telephone surveys, which who is listening to landline telephone service. The sampling here is already problematic, but let's not get too empirical with that, right? So let's say they see one poll and then they come into the news and they're like, well, the polling says conclusively that we cannot have universal healthcare, like nobody wants it. But okay, actually people want it. Let's use that example. The polling says people want sorry, I lost my train of thought. The polling says something. The polling says X is true. And then me, the receiver of news, is going to be like, oh, so polling says that most people want universal healthcare. So I will want universal healthcare. And maybe that has been the case because in the US, there is an increasing desire in the population for universal healthcare, right? It didn't, and it happened in a very short amount of time. And that's maybe one positive example of how these media narratives lead to reality, but there's a lot of counterfactuals to that. There's many instances where the media will come in and say, okay, we cannot have green energy for this reason, like 60% of, I'm making up this data, this isn't real, 60% of Americans want to drive their cars to work, so they don't support like railroad investments or whatever. And then, you know, you're like this person who doesn't think about these things very much, but the news says, you know, people don't really want railroads. Then who am I to come in and be like, I want railroads, I like my car, I like driving, I want to conform. And then that person's opinions becomes the same as these poll results, and then they reinforce these ideas. And then when they reinforce, next time they're polled, they're again reinforcing this narrative. So what media does, it is creates a narrative about reality, and reality is inherently elusive. We cannot really grasp it in terms of describing the, you know, we can only grasp it if we agree that we are going to present facts, and only presenting facts just doesn't exist anymore. So it's all about who's the first to create a media narrative and what that narrative then spirals onto. It takes on a life of its own within this capitalism.
And it reinforces itself. And there's the hyperreal aspect. I mean, to be a little political, right? When people say X candidate is the most electable because people like them. Why do people like them? Well, because they're the most electable. And then it, you know, that becomes a truth. But where does that begin, right? What is the actual real behind that? That's you know, what Bhandari calls a simulacrum, right? It's there's no way of telling what the original idea is, right? Do people like this candidate? It gets so lost because it's so reinforcing, right? There's no, we don't even remember where the original idea came from. And, you know, maybe it was the case, maybe X candidate was liked, but at the point that it's discussed, right, it's already taken on this life of its own, this tautological, you know, way of viewing it.
Yeah. And so we live in this like hyper reality, right? And that's part of capitalist realism. Going back to capitalist realism, one of the things that have been normalized in this hyper reality is that capitalism is the only way and there is no alternative. This idea has become normalized through this process of hyper reality by forces like the media that determine to an extent what people think, what people's opinions are, and the like, right? So that's part of where our like idea of like we cannot change this comes from. And in relation to that, I wanted to talk about some of the examples, and we'll come back to Baudrillard. Fisher talks about the examples of the movie WALL-E, about Kurt Cobain, and hip hop particularly. And he says that in page 10, in relation to hip hop, that in the end, it is precisely hip hop's performance of the first version of Real. Well, okay, we have to go back a little bit further. Real has two meanings. First, it means authentic, uncompromised music that refuses to sell out to the music industry and soften its message for crossover. Real also signifies that the music reflects a reality constituted by late capitalist economic instability, institutionalized racism, and increased surveillance and harassment of youth by the police. Real means that the death of the social. It means corporations whose respond to increased profits not by raising pay or improving benefits, but by downsizing. And then he talks more about this idea of the duality of realism when it comes to music. In the end, it was precisely hip hop's performance of this first version of real, the uncompromising, that enabled its easy absorption into the second, the reality of late capitalist economic instability, where such authenticity has proven highly marketable. So, what do you think of that? This idea that, hip hop speaks to a lot of truth about the lived reality of people in specific demographics that are dealing with racial issues and issues with policing, but then at the level of the media and popularization of it, it is marketable because it's speaking of these very brutal truths.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is another level of the way things become marketized and commodified, right? Fisher talks about in the book, even anti-capitalist, or hip hop is broader than that. There's also anti-racist. There's also anti-policing, anti-surveillance, right? Fisher talks about all those different aspects, right? But even those sort of subversive ideas, the market can accommodate that. They can sell that back to people in a way that benefits the market. I mean, because what is the alternative, right? Where are you going to get this information from? The market has no problem sort of taking these things that are criticizing it and selling it back to people, right? And so that's how it embodies sort of both realities, right? Because it embodies sort of this, all these harsh, it discusses all these harsh realities, and it's also about the sort of way in which there's a certain helplessness of resisting it, right? There's all these problems, and sort of what happens then is it becomes commodified and marketed back, right? So it's real in terms of speaking to the harsh truths, but it's also real in that it's realistic about the only way to sort of get this out to people is through the very sort of powers that be. So it speaks truth to power through using power as a method of sending it out to people. And that, that contradiction is what makes it sort of artistically very rich, but also which makes, that sort of neutralizes the subversive power of the art form.
Yeah, actually, I have a note here saying, note to self, assign 15 million merits, Black Mirror episode. There is a very good dystopian fiction episode of the Black Mirror that does sort of show some of these ideas. So I will be assigning that as a companion to this video. I think when you're watching that, think about the ideas that Professor Marchia just said of, using the channels of the powers to subvert the powers, but then being commodified in the process and what that looks like. So Fisher also talks about the entertainment and industrial complex. What do you see as the entertainment industrial complex?
I'm blanking on how he describes it.
Yeah, me too. Well, so I only have noted some page numbers here because I was doing this frantically yesterday. Well, he's just talking about just all of it, right? Every market profitable, market driven entertainment system. And we can also introduce news media into this, because news media is, at least in the United States, a private marketable industry, and it is a form of entertainment for people today, right? Like this whole idea of turning politics into a reality TV show is pretty popular among some scholars. And so he's talking about just the entertainment industry broadly as a force of capitalist realism in and of itself, right? As this entity, independent entity, entertainment and media as this independent entity that has the ability to determine and dictate the terms of culture and the terms of realism and what that looks like.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So entertainment is a commodity in capitalism, right? And also in this late stage of capitalism, everything's turned and commodified. So, right, again, going back to the example of hip hop, right? It has the potential as a politically robust art form to be more than entertainment, but even that is turned back in entertainment. The whole thing is flattened, and the same thing with politics, right? I mean, the reality TV show that politics has become, right?
Yeah.
The reality TV star as president, right? The entertainer as president, Kanye West running for president, right? The way in, the way in which these sort of, even things that are political are collapsed back into entertainment because they're commodified, right? Even things that are supposed to be about trying to take us beyond just looking at things in a market commodity way, in an entertainment way, things that are supposed to make us really question things, they get flipped back around, and again they become different forms of entertainment, right? We could sort of even play act at having these revolutionary ideas, and they're also part of the media and what the entertainment industrial complex.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, I mean, Netflix can put out a entire series on what do they have, something like Dirty Money, about all these nefarious actors and the profit motive, and put out documentaries on how the profit motive ruins
Right.
healthcare sector, right? But they're implicated in it too, and it's also something that but what choice do they have, even, right? There's no way to sort of get outside of it from inside of it.
Yeah. So like we're all living in this entertainment hyperreality, and it's all being driven by these forces of capitalism and capitalist realism that drive the entertainment industrial complex, that then drives our understanding of what reality is, then commodifies it when we challenge those understandings and those same systems, because that's just the process and the cycle that operates almost independently. So chapter 6, I think, is very important, and I know this segment is running long, but since this is the key to the class, let's allow ourselves to keep going. So chapter 6 is called All That Is Solid Melts into PR, Market Stalinism and Bureaucratic Anti-Production. And I have a lot of notes here, but we'll just get right to the point. So on page 43, Fisher is talking about Stalin's White Sea Canal project, one of the many failures maybe of that particular government, and what is used in capitalist realism as an example of like why, we should steer clear of that sort of thing. So Stalin was trying to make this canal, and all the canal could support apparently were tourist streamers. Turned out it wasn't very safe. There was a lot of issues with it, but then Stalin spent a bunch of money creating it, and then invited a lot of Western tourists or global tourists to come and take a look. And the canal was a triumph of publicity, but if half the care that went into the public relations campaign had been devoted to the work itself, there would have been far fewer victims and far more real developments, and the project would have been a genuine tragedy rather than a brutal farce in which real people were killed by pseudo event. And then Fisher is saying that this happened in Stalinism, but this is the everyday reality of everything that operates in a capitalist society, right? So we can critique this in Stalinism, and people do, but then they don't reflect back on our ways of doing things and say, oh my God, everything is a PR move. Like, for example, like, let's look at like with COVID-19. I mean, all these institutions making decisions based on science and not science, and then turning that into a blurb about, responsibility, and every institution has a PR office that handles everything. And so whatever happens in the public sphere, whatever actions any institutions engage in, it is all modulated by this sort of, how does this look? How does this present? So it's packaged. It's all theatrics in the end, right? It's all a way to show a version of truth that is desirable to the entity of interest rather than truth itself.
Yeah, and this is part of, to even now take from, the example of hip hop, right? Taking that thing, subversive potential thing, and turning it back into a market commodity, right? This is the same thing that capitalism can do with crises, with legitimate crises. If everything's about sort of PR story and spin, everything's at that superficial level, then a crisis isn't even a crisis. It's an opportunity for a new story, and that new story can, expand can make market inroads into new sectors of society, right? I mean, look at how many commercials are about in these horrible times, just know our company is here for you, right? This is an economic crisis, but
Yeah. Yeah.
it's also an opportunity
Yeah.
for them, for a car company to take that and really trying to spin it. At the real level it's a problem, but if at the level of PR and story and narrative, it's only more of an opportunity for these companies to ingratiate themselves as being your friends almost.
Absolutely. And that's the same with like climate change, right? You have like Mobil like putting out these ads about how they're at the forefront of the renewable energy problem solution, when I mean Mobil is like a third of the reason we are dealing with climate change. That's on the level of consensus truth or reality, but at the level of capitalist realism and this hyper reality we live in, this company can come in and try to convince us on live TV that they are working really hard to combat this elusive external problem of climate change that they in no way, shape, or form created, but rather the fact that we are all anxious and concerned about this is an opportunity for them to sell us more fuel, to sell us more things, and that's just brilliant. This is, I think, at the center of hyper reality, right? It's this idea that our own miseries and our own like worst fears and neuroses are sold back to us constantly via PR and advertisement, and on some level we're aware of this, and we participate because of capitalist realism, because what else are we gonna do?
Right. Yeah. And to take it back, right, that seems so illogical that that's how people would respond to crises, as a potential for, having an economic windfall. But even though it seems counterintuitive, it's because the higher logic is the economic logic,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's all of it's an opportunity for profit
Yeah.
generation.
Yeah. And that's where, at that level, is where we really need to think about why is the economics so central to our lived realities, going back to the very first part of this, the capitalism of it all. Like, we have made it such a central force of operation of all reality that it allows for these ridiculous inconsistencies and absurdities, like during this global pandemic, these ads about how buying this car is somehow going to ease our anxieties, ease our troubles, and that is the absurd dystopian reality we live in, and that is capitalist realism. And media, obviously, through all of these mechanisms of hyper reality, through this entertainment industrial complex that we live in, and through PR and advertising, is just sort of reproducing the malaise of capitalism realism constantly.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are you gonna?
And
Yeah.
related, have you noticed this new phenomena that I think is really interesting and weird, which is like corporations being Twitter brands, right? You have like Wendy's or McDonald's putting like sassy meme tweets to each other, like sort of participating as if they are friends or celebrities, sort of having these silly clapbacks. It's a strange new like simulation of of corporations as people,
Wow.
right? I mean, who was it, Mitt Romney, that like made the argument corporations are people, and people kind of people laughed at that idea, right? But then you see today that's more true than ever, right? You see, there's a personality of the Twitter account of like a whatever Stouffer's macaroni and cheese, like it's super bizarre.
Wow, no, that's brilliant. I had seen that and I had not thought about that in this context, actually. Yeah, that's a very good example of corporations infiltrating the public space in like these like nefarious but seemingly friendly ways. Like this thing you mentioned it earlier. It's just this idea that we're your friends and we're here to help you, rather than like, okay, we're our alliances with this capital and this economic interest that actively is the reason why you
Yeah.
are unhappy in life.
Yeah, I remember people being like, "Oh, Wendy's is so funny." I'm like, "Who the fuck is Wendy's?" That's a corporate entity with a PR appendage designed.
Oh, oh man. Yeah, no, that's great. And I encourage students to keep an eye out for that in your own social media, because as soon as Professor Marchia pointed it out, I could remember a bunch of different instances of thinking, why am I seeing this? Why is McDonald's telling me to have a nice run today? Like, what's that about? So yeah, keep an eye out for that. And that's a great transition to, let's talk about, to wrap up this concept, there is the concept of market Stalinism in chapter 6 that I want you all to focus on in this text. And this is where the term Stalinism comes from, right? Like in the past, we were like, oh, Stalinism is like when you like fake make a canal and then try to like give it a positive reputation via PR. Now we live in the world of market Stalinism, where everything is that crappy canal that is going to result in various deaths and other forms of depravities in human life. And so market Stalinism is the reality of our hyperreality model of living in this media world. Okay, so I want to end and wrap up with this idea of the internet itself, which you just brought up, and as a great example, things are changing, have been changing. It's hard to contextualize the internet into conversations about the media, because it's almost as if there is two medias, right? But there isn't, right? There both are two medias and not. There is the mainstream media, the news, the entertainment. And then there is the internet, where it's self-creation, free for all, open content. What is the word for it, where everybody participates?
Democratic.
No. I would not say the internet is democratic. Maybe that's an empirical question.
Well, go ahead.
No, you go.
I think there's two different ways of viewing what the internet is, but I don't know if you want to get into it right now.
Let's get into it. I mean, Fisher only talks about the internet in one page, and I really wanted us to add to that, because
it might be more helpful if you introduce where you wanted to go with it, and then I'll introduce sort of how I think about.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Fisher talks a lot about this big other that we're always performing for. All of our opinions, all of our ideas, all of our taste preferences are happening because we think we're being sort of washed by this big brother type, like panoptic on Foucauldian thing that we are performing to constantly. And he's talking about that in relation to PR and hyperreality. But I think that that's something that can be applied to the internet, right? In a sense, now the internet is the big other, and that it literally is watching us and tracking us. And right now, like, it's watching us now, and we are performing to it. I mean, ostensibly we're teaching students, but also at the same time we are performing to the internet. And he sees it as a problem, I guess. And I don't know where I stand on this, because Fisher wrote this book in 2009, and the internet's history is short and very long at the same time, and it has been through all sorts of peaks and troughs of, you know, all the worst and the most terrible and the most beautiful and the most wonderful things have come out of it simultaneously. And I feel like Fisher doesn't spend enough time talking about it, and about it as a force of, what I'll say, as a mechanism of challenging and overcoming capitalist realism. He doesn't say that. He talks about the critiques of Curtis on page 75. So this other scholar, Curtis, attacks the internet because in his view, it facilitates communities of solipsists, people that think that they're the only thing that exists, interpassive networks of like minds who conform rather than challenge each other's assumptions and prejudices. But Curtis claims the impact of internet lobbies on old media is disastrous, since not only does its reactive proactivity allow the media class to further abnegate its function to the educated and lead, it also allows populist currents on both left and the right to bully media producers into turning out programming that is mediocre. Curtis's critique has a point, but it misses an important dimension of what is happening on the net. Contrary to Curtis's account of blogging, blogs can generate new discourse networks that have no correlate in the social feed field outside of cyberspace, right? As old media increasingly becomes subsumed into PR, which we've talked about at length now, and the consumer report replaces the critical essay, some zones of cyberspace offer resistance to the critical compression that is elsewhere depressingly pervasive. Nevertheless, the interpassive simulation of participation in postmodern media, the network narcissism of MySpace and Facebook, has, in the main, generated content that is repetitive, parasitic, and conformist. So he's saying it has the opportunity for new ideas, but there are no new ideas nonetheless. And I don't know to what extent I agree with that. What do you?
I don't know either. I mean, I think of the internet in two ways. On one level, it's just a mechanism of communication and setting out ideas, pure and simple, like putting aside whatever form the internet has taken, whatever trends are happening, right? It is purely just a decentralized way of getting information or content out into the world. It's, you have to be connected to Wi-Fi. That's some barrier to access, but beyond that, nominally, there's also censorship, but supposedly it's free open access to ideas that you don't have to have a news media network to do, right? In that way, it's very decentralized and democratic. There's also, I think, the opposite tendency that's happening, which is, right, I think actually this tendency is happening because of the radical potential of the internet, right, of this disseminated information, that you see a push to privatize it as much as possible, right? So the internet by itself as a mode of communication could be very radical, but then you have things like Facebook or Twitter, Zoom, whatever, that are that capture your data, right? That do also censorship in ways that are not very obvious, right? But they do it nonetheless, right? And so you have, right, yes, people use Twitter also for, things like Black Lives Matter, the Arab Spring, right? But really what's powerful is the internet itself, right? This way of communicating. But you also have the way that it's privatized, that is operating behind the scenes as a way to clamp down on this. I mean, you do have all these different ways that whatever, maybe the Twitter algorithm works, or maybe the way that the data collection of Facebook works, right? That also manipulate, right? That also manipulate the conversation in a way we don't know, because they don't tell us, here's what Twitter says about the news, here's what Facebook, official statement has to say, but whatever, through advertisements, sponsored tweets, censorship, right? That what's difficult is also that they give us the illusion that this is part of the, what the internet most radically is, which is open and free, in a way that it's not. And so I think people conflate these when they talk about the internet. They say that the internet, ideally, right, for people that are very optimistic, it is this radical tool, and I think it's fully true. Then you have people that say it's actually not because of all these reasons, but it's not a fault of the way that the internet, what it can be, or what it is as a mode of communication. It's a fault of the privatization of the internet, I would say.
I think that is to an extent true, but and there is more than that, right? People have mobilized the internet towards nefarious means. I mean, look at the 2016 elections. I'm not going to say that the alt-right created the political situation we have now, but if we were looking at it as a flurry of explanations for why Donald Trump got elected, for example, part of the R square would be explained ostensibly by the people on the internet that mobilized one another, right? And that was a success. And the Arab Spring, which we're going to have a significant portion of this semester, is going to focus on social movements and new media, because I think this is where the most exciting stuff is. But in terms of how it operates, the Arab Spring, Black Lives Matter, this year, and Arab Spring in 2011, they have very similar processes, right? That in both cases, some act of brutality went viral on the internet, and then people use the internet to mobilize one another to have spontaneous social movements. And so we're going to talk a lot about spontaneous social movements and what that means for the future of change and whatever. But I just want to focus on, like, the other side of this is like that. Yes, we've had like people vaguely on the left mobilized, but we've also had people on the right mobilized successfully on the internet, right? So neither of those are like sort of, as far as I know, again, I don't know how, I don't claim to know how Twitter algorithms work, but this seems that both of these things have been able to exist in spite of the algorithms that might play the function of the old media in like directing narratives, right? In spite of what the algorithm has been saying, people have found ways to share ideas, share unusual ideas, to actual, political change, and not so much with Arab Spring. I mean, yes, absolutely. With Arab Spring, there was a complete breakdown of several authoritarian governments. But now, if we look at it, there has been a lot of these processes have been reversed. And I guess, no, this is not the time to talk about this. We'll come back to this. But my point is that the internet is different to me, as far as I see it, from mainstream media in that, yes, it also drives narratives, and it also has the problem of the bubble, right? Everybody is conforming into their little spaces. I only follow people I agree with, or like people that think like me, or whatever, and so forth. And then there's the algorithms that are corporations trying to tell us where to look and what to think and what to buy. But I think outside of that, the internet is so vast, and the corollary to this is like mainstream media is about creating one narrative, right? They decide, it's like top down. Here's the narrative. You're all going to follow this narrative. The internet is a billion narratives. It's billions of narratives, all sort of like meshing together in this completely hyper-real way. And from there comes a variety of different things. And some of it is this old school, like, corporations directing narratives, and some of this is this new people being like, no, wait, after we have been engaging with each other on these new ideas, I feel like things are not quite right and we should do things a little bit differently. And so we've seen both in recent, let's say, decades. And so to me, we can look at the internet as glass half full and glass half empty simultaneously, almost.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is, there's the radical potential of the internet, but there's also the radical risks of the internet. I mean, but this is part of the, you look at the centralized news media, they give you this little circle of ideas. Well, the internet's giving you this, and that has a lot of, we're not confined by this little thing. We have all these ideas out there. And, from, depending on your perspective, right, there's some excellent ideas out there, and there's some really terrible ideas out there, and both are now sort of accessible in a way that they weren't before, and that carries its own risks, right? And so there is the potential for very emancipatory movements, at the same time for very repressive or reactionary movements to flourish there. And I mean,
we've seen both happen, and this is true. It's true. It's like there's more potential for new information that is helpful, and there's more potential for new information that is dangerous. But the bounds have been expanded, like you said.
Yeah, which I think just sort of heightens the stakes of what's happening. I mean, it's to a certain amount, the risk that we take to get to these other ideas, right, is all these, to hopefully get to a place where we can get out the good ideas. A lot of bad ideas have to happen, and there's some sort of maybe middle ground between radically all the ideas out there in play and the other extreme of just a little bit of ideas in play. And I think we're still, the internet's so new, right? It hasn't reached that equilibrium yet. It's still in this sort of thing where all these ideas, and it hasn't been reined in yet. And or what journey it could take, I think it's so new. So that's why I say radical potential, not radical, it's not automatically.
Absolutely. And that's what, like, part of like the alt-right being so involved in political outcomes in the United States, for example, is an example of some unforeseen strange effects of the internet. And I just want to say, so from a capitalist realist perspective, what I'm trying to wonder and leave my students to think about is having this broader scope of possible ideas. Does it give us the opportunity, to give us more opportunities to challenge capitalist realism as opposed to the old way of doing media? And my instinct is to say yes, and this is not empirical by any means, so don't quote me on this. It's just my feeling is that although yes, the advent of the internet has comes with a variety of new challenges that we have to worry about, I think it's also because the space is less bounded in what ideas can be expressed, it creates a space where we can creatively think outside of the box about how society can be organized and then share that media among one another in a way that maybe you could in the past, like I don't know, people shared zines or whatever. But
Right. It's completely speculation, but this idea of taking a risk like that, of allowing, and again, there's, maybe a happy medium, but allowing more ideas than would be traditionally allowed, right? This idea of expanding beyond the boundaries of what's acceptable. I mean, right, that's, you look at Stalinism, Stalinist communism happening, and then people say, too risky. We can't risk changing capitalism. You expand that circle of ideas a little bit and chaos ensues. And maybe, but if you don't expand it, chaos ensues as well. And so it's, there's a lot of, that that willingness to take a risk and to hope or dream that taking that risk is maybe going to pay off in some way is part of expanding what's possible. And again, don't want to be too utopian to say, it's all going to be good necessarily with expanding the range of ideas, but there's, sometimes a little bit of a risk is necessary.
yeah, and I mean, speaking about hope, if we don't try new things, then we are stuck in the way things are, right? So I mean, again, I don't want to be the cyber optimist, and I know that the internet can be a very dangerous place, but now with COVID-19, I feel like we are also trapped in this other level of hyperreality. It's this 2D level where more of us are almost forced to live on the internet for longer periods of time. So we can either be optimistic about it or pessimistic about it, like with anything else. And like remove the internet from this society, and chaos still is pervasive. Chaos is water. Chaos is capitalist realism, right? So with this thing that we have where we can share ideas, good and bad and terrible and wonderful ideas, I think that my personal inclination is to be hopeful that ultimately this second society, right? We have society, and then we have the simulacra of society, which is the internet, which is also a whole fun topic to explore at another time. But we have society, and then we have the e-society, and society has clearly done a terrible job of organizing itself, but e-society is it's a baby. Can it organize itself better? That's an empirical question, and we need decades of data, decades, more centuries, I mean, however long we're gonna be watching and recording this information for. I don't want to go too far into the dark, and let's wrap up final thoughts, and then we're gonna do a sort of postscript video about why capitalist realism is ultimately an optimistic idea. Any last thoughts about the theory, the media?
The media in general, I mean, I think it's clear how it sort of ties in. And I think the internet's something new. And again, this book was written in 2008, and wow, how things have changed since then with the internet. And I think it remains to be seen. And it's interesting to speculate on what journey it may take. But definitely, it's as this is a media class, and you're thinking about these questions, and I think it's 100% something to really pay attention to. And capitalist realism is one frame of looking at what this new media is.
Yeah, thank you. This is really awesome. All right, we will come back shortly for our wrap up on capitalist realism, and see you all soon. Thank you, Professor Marchia. We'll be back.